Welcome back to the Fishing Daily podcast. In this episode, I am joined by James Hodgkinson, who is the researcher at the Adam Smith Institute, and we'll be discussing his paper, Plenty More Fish in the Sea, which was recently published and is available on the Fishing Daily website here to read. Welcome, James.
Thank you very much, and it's lovely to be here. Thank you for having me.
James, your paper has created a lot of interest, and speaking to some number of the fishing representatives around the UK, they have a lot of questions that would like to be answered in relation to it. I suppose the first one we'll talk about is the claim that UK coastal waters are systematically being overfished. Now, this is a charge that's been rejected by fishing organisations. But even in your own terms, how can giving small boat skippers permanent fish quotas save the British fleet when 79% of those vessels primarily fish for non-quota species such as crabs, lobsters and scallops?
I think, first of all, just to tackle the overfishing claim head on, where I sit on it, if you look at the market for fish, the market is actually saying that it itself is not confident in the way fish stocks are being managed. Only in February of this year did Waitrose come out with a statement saying that they would no longer stock mackerel due to overfishing concerns. And when you look at government data, I think it's about 45% of tax they reckon are set fully in line with scientific advice and sustainable. Other environmental advocacy groups have higher figures for unsustainability than that. So I think there is a problem here. Now, in terms of how we set quota and how the paper looks to, if you like, support that environmental sustainability, we're looking at doing that in two main ways. So first of all, we believe at the ASI that property rights and giving people that permanent, true ownership of their quota is the best way to encourage sustainable management, and that goes for all species. And on the second point about shellfish, the fact that these species aren't currently quoted and no one owns them is, in my view, precisely the reason why we need to give people ownership of them. Because since 1938, the amount of shellfish that's caught in British waters has gone up by 276%. So these populations are under immense pressure. And I would much prefer that we came in now with a system that is fair, that is just, that is equitable for fishermen, rather than come in at a crisis point in 10, 15 years' time and have to really disrupt the market and the communities that it supports.
But James, looking at a species such as mackerel, that's a species that is also outside of the UK waters. How can setting permanent quota for the UK fleet affect the conservation of that stock when you have the likes of Norway, Iceland, Faroe Islands, and Russia, who are all fishing that species as well?
Absolutely true that a lot of fish stocks are not just contained within our waters, and a lot of fish species are migratory. So management up the chain and down the chain does have a real impact. But the truth is, we do set quotas for these species. The government does set catch limits. And so what we at the ASI advocate, and what people in the free market movement have advocated for years, is that the best way to sustainably fish these fish is to give fishermen ownership over what is theirs. And if the government have tax that they can set, then we believe those quotas should be given on as permanent a basis as possible to British fishermen. The other thing that I would just mention is that the sustainability piece is only one arm of why we believe that these quotas and giving people permanent ownership of quotas is so important. And again, while it doesn't apply to mackerel specifically because it's often fished by larger vessels, giving smaller scale fishermen quotas that they own has economic benefits too. Because if you are a small fisherman and you're drawing entirely from the pool, you don't necessarily have an asset that you can use as a resource to trade, to lease, or to sell. For example, let's say you wanted to buy a larger boat, or you wanted to upgrade your boat or repair your boat. You can't use that quota from the pool as loan collateral because you don't own it. So this is about leveling the playing field between the smallest operators and the largest operators to ensure that whoever you are, you can use the market in the same way and unlock the same benefits and opportunities.
Well, another issue as well is that the fishing quotas are set on ICE's advice. How would that be combated, say, if ISIS gives advice that a species should be not fished, as what happened with pollock?
So we wholeheartedly support scientific advice, and alongside industry engagement, it's something that should be absolutely the guiding principle for any quotas which are set. The whole point between giving people shares of the quota is they have a direct stake in how that stock is managed and how it goes forward. So let's take the example of pollock. If the quota is cut because scientific advice says that that fish stock is overfished, then the following year, the real terms tonnage that people can take out the sea will drop accordingly. But on the contrary, if people manage that resource sustainably, if populations grow, the premise is that they will be rewarded automatically for that sustainable management. Their stake in the quota remains the same. The only thing that changes is how much scientists, government, hopefully in consultation with industry, say should be fished within a year.
And say now, if there was non-quota species such as crabs, lobsters, and scallops, if they were brought into a quota system, how would that be distributed?
So I would like to see non-quota species distributed on the basis of the catch history of vessels that have been fishing them. Because to me, and they are small vessels in the main, which is brilliant because this is all about securing a better deal for smaller vessels. For me, if you have one of these smaller vessels that have been catching this fish stock, let's say lobster, for a number of years, they should absolutely not lose out under this system. Instead, what they gain is a valuable resource that they can use to do all the things I've already spoken about, and that's to trade, to lease, to use as collateral to upgrade their vessel, and effectively give them the same power in the market as someone who's fishing with quota that they own.
What about new species that would be coming into UK waters? We've seen the likes of bluefin tuna, anchovies, etc. How would you distribute the quota in regards to that?
Well, I think new quota presents a really exciting opportunity for the industry, first of all, especially if those fish species are high value. That's something that we should absolutely welcome. What a share-based ITQ system gives you is flexibility. Now, in terms of the paper itself, we didn't actually cover new species explicitly, but it would seem to me that the natural extension of our system would be that you have a new quota come in and you do one of two things. You either look at fish quota that have been taken out of UK waters due to temperature change, climate change, and where the type of fish, the way it would be caught, the boat type is comparable with a quota that might have been lost, you might pass that on to fishermen in that manner. If you don't do that, your other option is that you look to auction that quota off. So the government would say, look, in consultation with scientists, we're now confident we have enough of this new fish stock in our oceans to make it sustainable, viable, and fishable. And in that case, we as the government will sell that on to the highest bidder and to the fishermen who can make the most valuable use of it in a way which is both sustainable and ongoing, has an economic potential to generate wealth for the fishermen and the exchequer.
Well, in a lot of situations, fishermen might not be able to afford to buy this quota, and this quota might end up going elsewhere into the private hands of a company from offshore. How can that be avoided?
Well, we were very clear within the paper that we wanted to protect British fishing from overseas, if you like, offshore investors. What we said was that there should be two very distinct types of quota. There should be quota that are freely tradable within the British Isles, and that should be equivalent to the quota which is here now. And there should be quota which is overseas, maybe in the future, when we look at maybe getting quota back as a result of what might happen in 2038 with our negotiations with the European Union. I would feel comfortable with new quota for British stocks replacing quota for British stocks that is lost. And in that way, you could potentially guard against that foreign investment that I can understand that fishermen might be concerned about.
You argue that under 10-metre vessels are trapped by restrictive government pool limits. Given that these inshore pools are regularly left uncaught, and small boat skippers are actually constrained by weather, fuel costs, and vessel size, how can you claim paper quota allocations are the real operational bottleneck?
I'm really glad that you brought this up because I know it was a concern that Mike Cohen had. What I would say to that concern and what I'd say to you is that the fact that these quotas aren't being utilised is not a symptom of success. I would argue it's actually a symptom of failure. Since 2008, in the under 10 sector, days at sea have fallen by 44% and unemployment has increased by 47%. So that shows you that something is not working. Fishermen are not able to go out and do what they did 20 years ago in the same manner. So if anything, it's a call to change. It's a call to go, how can we, as a state, how can the government enable fishermen to make better use of their quota? And specifically on concerns like fuel costs, on concerns about boat size, this is exactly what giving these small-scale fishermen quota would allow them to do, because it would allow them to use the quota as collateral to invest in larger boats. It would allow them to use the quota to invest in more efficient boats. So all these things can be overcome, and I really hope they are. But it starts with being honest about where the system works and being honest about where it fails. And I'm afraid, particularly with the under 10s, the situation I see at the moment is bleak.
But could you say that maybe the reason why a lot of these inshore pools are left uncaught is not so much the fact that it's due to operational bottlenecks? Could it be more of a symptom of an aging population of fishermen that's operating on these boats rather than anything else?
I think that may be part of the problem, but the other thing to consider is why that is the case. Because if you have an industry where young people don't feel it is viable because of the level of regulation on them, because of the fact that they're locked in these unworkable systems, you're obviously going to see your workforce age and potentially their productivity decrease. But again, for the under 10 vessels, if we are able to secure them permanent tradable rights, they can then pass them down to their children and their grandchildren. So you may actually end up with more legacy within fishing and more younger generations coming through. And that's something that I would really hope would happen.
Regarding the paper, it points to Iceland's individual transferable quota system as a model for efficiency, yet Iceland's scheme triggered massive corporate consolidation and pushed traditional coastal communities out of the market. Why do you believe your proposed ownership caps won't be easily bypassed by holding companies and armchair admirals in the exact same way?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that we're very careful in the paper not to point to Iceland as a model of extreme success. In fact, I would argue we regard it more as a cautionary tale. There are two main mistakes that I think the Icelandic government made when they brought in their quota system. The first of which was originally they put no caps in whatsoever for the under 10 metre vessels. So you saw loads and loads of people go out and buy under 10 metre boats to get around the caps, which worsened the health of fish stocks. And the second thing was that their ownership caps were not stringent, as you rightly point out. What we're proposing is not only would you have ownership caps in the conventional sense, but you'd extend that to beneficial caps, to de facto ownership if you have leases that go over a certain time period. Because if we're going to put these caps in place, they need to ensure that they're not just blocking fishermen acting in good faith from consolidating and from owning more of a stock, but that they stop everyone and that they protect fishermen, because there's no point creating a system where it harms those who obey the rules and benefits those who try and get around them.
You propose converting the EU's percentage quota share into fixed numerical tonnage so the UK can keep any sustainability dividend. But if a fish stock drops, wouldn't holding foreign fleets to a rigid fixed tonnage force British skippers to absorb 100% of the conservation cuts?
It's a valid concern, and it's certainly something that would have to be borne in mind if this strategy was to be pursued in negotiations with the European Union. In effect, what it is, and I admit it's a gamble, is a bet on the sustainability of British fisheries. Now, I would not suggest for a minute that the government should go out and pursue that for all fish stocks, because there are some fish stocks that are in long-term trends of decline. And in those cases, the deal we've got now is probably better. But there are some fish stocks where we know we're doing great work here in Britain to make them sustainable, and we know that their populations are not declining in the manner of others. And where that is the case, we should look to be bold, because when you look at the legacy of Brexit, you look at what British fishermen were promised, and what's been delivered, which, by the way, to me seems like next to nothing. we owe it to fishermen to try something different. We owe it to fishermen to take those Brexit freedoms to deliver something tangible and something useful. And if that involves a bit of risk, I think that's something that needs to be welcomed when it's proportionate.
And how would it operate in regards, as we're looking at now, there's a lot of issues towards spatial squeeze around UK coastal waters with marine protected areas and offshore wind farms. You're asking people to buy in the quota idea when there is a lot of outside pressures on the industry.
Well, the first thing to say is that the one thing that fishermen wouldn't be buying into is fixed tonnage. We're very clear that it will be a proportion. So you would have a share in the uplift of sustainable management. And if things aren't going so well, you take a proportional share in any downturn. But I think in terms of external pressures, when I was talking to parliamentarians, when I was making this paper and architecting the policy, what was very clear is that a lot of people, there are a lot of MPs in the House now who believe that fishermen are the best conservators of the sea. I believe that as well. I'm not happy to see, massive wind farms going up in British waters. I don't think that's fair. I don't think that's acceptable. I think it's damaging to the long-term health and sustainability of our seas. But we do have to trust fishermen. We have to listen more closely to their voice, because although fishing is a relatively small proportion of the British economy, it's about time people realise and remember that in the areas that do depend on it, it's absolutely vital for local life.
Yeah, that's very true. Like a lot of small communities around the coast depend on a few fishermen in order to keep that community together. But let's talk about the summit in May 2025, which locked the UK into reciprocal access, again under the UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement until 2038. Is it realistic to demand a complete rewrite of international treaty terms to enforce fixed tonnage when the EU will obviously reject a deal where they take all the downside risk and none of the recovery upside?
We are very clear in the paper that overruling this massive agreement in wholesale terms is unfeasible. And we have to remember as well that the deal was not just about fishing. There were concessions that were made on fishing, which allowed the government to secure other things. And so the idea that the government would ever be willing to simply rip it up, I think, is incorrect. What we have to do is we'd have to go back to the European Union and be innovative. And as I've said, this is a system which is a gamble. It is a risk. It's, if you like, using our Brexit freedoms to try something radically different. And there may well be cases where interests align and something can be done. It would have to be worked out on a case-by-case basis, maybe even stock by stock. It's something that should be pursued, if possible, and if in the best interests of our fishermen.
Well, 2/3 of British seafood exports go directly to the EU market, relying on smooth trade access under sanitary and phytosanitary rules. Aren't you risking severe trade retaliation and export barriers on 67% of your seafood trade just to chase a unilateral quota change that violates international agreements?
No, because what we would be doing is we'd be going to the Europeans and asking them whether they wish to come to the table. We're not proposing ripping anything up because, as you've mentioned, that would be disastrous for the fishing industry and for the wider economy. And I'm not saying the deal is good. What I'm saying is that now we've got it, it's very hard to get out of it. So, of course, we have to consider the trade implications. We have to remember that the European Union is a vital trading partner. But as I say, if interests align and there's an opportunity to attempt to secure a better deal for fishermen, after the betrayals of the last decade, it's beholden on any government to do so.
Looking at this common fisheries policy, maybe does that need to be wrapped up and reconsidered, especially when you've outlined so much that could benefit the UK waters? Could that be transferred into EU waters?
Well, I do believe that the ITQ system, giving all fishermen of all sizes a permanent and tradable stake in the quota, is the way forwards. Like, if you look at what New Zealand have been able to do on that system, it's been a real success. And even in terms of unemployment in New Zealand, which I know is a concern, and we're seeing rising unemployment in fishing now. If you look at unemployment in New Zealand since 1995, the number of fishermen employed has only dropped by 200 nationally. So there are ways to do this where you stave off unemployment and you boost sustainability, and that's what we want to do. My focus and the ASI's focus is always on British domestic policy, and we don't tend to sort of stray beyond our own borders. But I would say to the European Union, and if there's the appetite, if there's the will to look at the common fisheries policy and implement something similar, they should absolutely consider it.
Coming back to the paper, you're opposed creating a single electronic trading market so quota automatically migrates to the most efficient operators. In reality, won't a digital exchange simply allow deep-pocketed corporate processing fleets to outbid local skippers and strip coastal communities of their heritage assets?
It's a valid concern. The way that we intend any sort of electronic quota market to work is to allow flexibility. Because, as I said earlier, days at sea in those under 10 fleets is down quite considerably. If they were under quota, let's say, and they also had this stake in the ITQ, they would still be more susceptible to things like extreme weather, things like prolonged periods of fuel price increases. And so there may be times where they do feel it's still not viable for them to go to sea. The advantage of this system is that it would allow them to instantly sell that quota to a larger boat who can use it, but crucially, actually get some financial benefit, because at the moment, if those boats go to sea, or don't go to sea rather, they get absolutely nothing. There are safeguards that we put in place as well in the design of the policy to protect small-scale fishermen. For example, the ownership caps that I've already discussed. But also, I think it's worth saying that consolidation is already happening in British fishing, and it's a grim reality, but it is the reality, and we must confront that head on. And I think in the last decade, the size of the under 10 fleet has reduced by something like 20%. So it's really, really considerable. And the difference is, under the current system, when those vessels leave, you don't have any quota rights because you're in the pool. The only thing you can sell is your boat, which is one asset. Under our proposals, if a fisherman did feel the need to leave, and they'd be far more likely to be able to make a sustainable living under our proposals, if they did feel the need to leave, they leave on their own terms. They leave with a quota asset that they can either lease or sell, and they leave with an ability to be able to pass that on to another generation if they wish to.
Your paper suggests using taxpayer-funded state tenders to buy back quota from overfished stocks. Why should the British public foot the bill to buy out fishing rights, only for the remaining shares to be turned into permanent private commercial property that can be sold or leased for private profit?
The importance of getting these quotas right at the policy design stage is, I think, paramount. And when you look, for example, at the New Zealand system, they did this quite successfully, and it was key to the political durability of the system. They bought out about 15,700 tons of quota at a cost of around about 40 million New Zealand dollars in 1980. And the danger of not doing this, the danger of the taxpayer not coming in and taking some of the pressure off overfished stocks, is that you set the system up so it's doomed to fail. The alternative to the taxpayer doing this and stepping in and giving fishermen who wish to get out, because none of this is to force fishermen to do it. It's simply to allow fishermen who wish to sell to the state at a competitive market price. The alternative is twofold. You either continue with unsustainable fishing, because one thing that we were not willing to do when we were designing this system is take quota away from fishermen unilaterally, or you do something of a 50-50 burden share, which we acknowledge in the paper is not ideal. We acknowledge that it shouldn't be the way forwards. And if it was, it may well be susceptible to legal challenge. So of the three options, I would argue that a competitive tender that forces no one to sell and allows fishermen to get a fair market value for what they may lose is the best way forwards.
And finally, could you explain how turning quota into permanent private assets could encourage better stewardship of fish stocks?
So the principle is that when you own something outright, you are more likely to take care of it, and you're more likely to embrace conserving it for your future generations or for your retirement. Now, under the current system, 79% of vessels don't have that stake, and we believe that that's wrong. As I've said, I and many policymakers believe that fishermen are some of the best conservators of the sea that we have. And so this policy does two things. First of all, it dramatically improves the incentives for them to continue sustainable stewardship of the sea where that's already taking place. And it also rewards them for what they're already doing to allow that to continue in a financially viable way for them going forwards.
You've had support from a number of MPs on this paper. Going forward, how realistic is it that the government would take this on and consider it?
Well, when we were going to parliamentarians in Westminster and indeed in some of the devolved assemblies as well, the reception was positive. We have also had positive reception from some industry groups as well. So there is appetite for reform out there. What this will come down to in terms of feasibility of implementation, we've provided what I think is a really comprehensive and politically durable and sensible framework. But what this is about is whether there is the appetite within this government or a future government for reform of fisheries, and whether there's an appetite for them to finally deliver some of what was promised during Brexit. Because, as I say, I have the most immense sympathy for fishermen. They were promised the world and have been delivered very little. And I believe if this policy was implemented, the wrongs of the past could start to be righted.
James Hodgkinson, thank you very much for joining us today on the podcast.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
If you like this episode or any of our other episodes, please hit the subscribe button and show your support for independent news in the fishing industry. Thank you.